Vampires have been a staple of paranormal storytelling for thousands and thousands of years, covering the entire globe in terms of myths and folklore, and in our modern tales, they represent everything from gritty urban feuds to glittery romantic interests. The evolution of vampire stories since Dracula was penned in the 1800s has been varied. We've had everything from The Lost Boys to Underworld to Interview with a Vampire and to the Twilight era that introduced paranormal romance and took over the shelves at Barnes & Noble. But today we're going to go back to 1897 when Bram Stoker penned Dracula after coming across the name in a story of a historical figure known as Vlad the Impaler. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be discussing my thoughts on the classic novel Dracula. Now Dracula certainly isn't the OG vampire story. We have Carmilla, which was penned before it in the 1800s, and we've had vampire stories of different shapes and sizes way back in history all over the world. While much of our modern storytelling tends to favor the suave, magnetic, and even sometimes heroic killer, the ancient version of these vampires was far less enticing. Folklore surrounding vampire-like beings can be traced back as far as ancient Mesopotamia and always surrounded the idea of undead, terrifying creatures coming back to haunt or harm the living. Even the term Nosferatu, which is used in Dracula the novel to describe the vampire creatures, can be found in Eastern European myth. Of course, closer to Stoker's own time period, he would have been drawing on these larger-than-life historical figures like Vlad the Impaler, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, and a smorgasbord of bits and pieces from all over mythology. The origin of vampire tales is actually really fascinating, and I could probably spend an entire video talking about it, but I want to jump into what makes Dracula so different than our modern tales of vampire characters today, and how the way that Dracula is written really adds to the horror that it creates. So what does Dracula do differently from a literary standpoint? I want to focus on something I'm going to call distance horror, something that really feeds into the fear of the unknown, the fear of the dark, and how Bram Stoker used that to really create the nightmare of his antagonistic character. When we get up close and personal with monsters in storytelling, we're often forced to focus on the aspects that are more relatable or familiar, the aspects of humanity within that monster, and we try to rationalize it to ourselves subconsciously a lot more. However, in Dracula, Stoker manages to keep us distanced and detached from that titular antagonist because he wants us to be deeply aware that there is no shred of humanity left. He is removing us from the familiar and the rational as far as possible through the structure of the story itself, through the POVs of the other characters, and through the actions and behaviors of Dracula. He gives Dracula an almost alien quality immediately and a sense of something being unnatural or wrong. We see different physical attributes that Jonathan Harker is noticing about him that give us the idea that something is not right, and that just continues to build in tension until we start seeing more alien qualities like Dracula climbing down the outside of a building at night. Whatever small charms Dracula may possess at the very beginning of the novel as we're being introduced to him, don't suggest a window into a deeper, more sympathetic soul. They're literally just tools that he is using to trap and ensnare his prey. And that leads us to what I think personally is the most structurally daring choice in the entire novel. Dracula is barely in it. After those initial chapters where we are in Count Dracula's castle with Jonathan Harker and we are getting this slow kind of descent into madness and terror, the Count kind of withdraws into the pages of the story as we move into the further sections of the book. He becomes an absence, a fear of the unknown and a fear of the dark. We've known just enough about him to make him terrifying, and then he simply fades into the background and haunts the open doorways of the long tunnel of the narrative moving forward in the story. We have no access to his thoughts. He doesn't really have a voice, which removes the sympathy that we often feel when we're introduced to a villain's point of view. Dracula isn't a character that you're meant to sympathize with or understand. He is literally a nightmare, a threat to be survived by the protagonists who are expecting him to appear around every corner. As a writer, I get really nerdy about the way that authors utilize the structure of their story to drive an emotion home further with the readers, and I think that Stoker does this in a really brilliant way by using an epistolary format, which basically just means that the entire book is told in a series of diary entries and letters and little newspaper clippings. We're never in a full POV at any given time, and because of that, it's adding to the sort of detached way that we're experiencing the characters, and especially Dracula, because not only are we removed from Dracula's perspective, we're removed from all of the character perspectives a step further, and Dracula is simply being experienced through a set of unreliable narrators. There is an aspect of twisted familiarity to Dracula, especially in the early chapters, where he's playing the part of a benevolent host, as it appears to Jonathan Harker at the very beginning. Even though things seem more than a bit off, he's bringing food, he's making sure that Harker is comfortable in the castle, and even as we get further into the horrors that are uncovered within that castle, we discover that Dracula has daughters, and there's this kind of demented family unit on display. This is a big contrast with the overabundance of humanity that we find on display in the rest of the cast. Stoker is almost so intent on keeping us focused on humanity over the monstrosity of Dracula and keeping that fear of the unknown that his protagonists become almost caricatures of mortality, as much as Dracula himself is an extreme manifestation of evil. So now that we've talked a bit about Stoker's overall choices in creating horror and detachment from our monster antagonist, let's talk about his prose and especially his characters. One thing that really surprised me while reading Dracula was how accessible his prose style was. Usually with classics, I kind of rate them on a scale of how likely would I be to recommend this to somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience with classics, and I actually think Dracula falls more toward the easy end of the spectrum in that respect, because the prose is very accessible, and the beginning of the novel especially provides a really engaging and atmospheric hook into the rest of the story and gives us a solid platform to build our understanding of the characters. There will be some mild spoilers in this section. This is, however, a 125-year-old book, so I think at this point we should be okay. The opening section of this novel, contrasted with the later part of the novel, are so different, in my opinion, and I had vastly different experiences with them that I'll obviously share with you guys. The opening part of the book is my absolute favorite, and I think it's some of my favorite classic writing that I have ever read, which really surprised me because I honestly was not expecting to be drawn in to this story as much as I was in the opening chapters in Dracula's castle. We're introduced to Dracula himself through the eyes of Jonathan Harker, who is a very idealistic young businessman who has left behind the love of his life, and he's going to handle some business for the Count. Now, obviously, very quickly, he discovers that things are not as they seem, and he is in horrible danger. The way that Harker's experience kind of disintegrates into this madness and terror throughout the opening section of this book is so well written, you guys. It is so gripping and enticing, and you're dying to peel back the next layer and find out what else is going on and journey through the forbidden parts of the castle with Jonathan as he's trying to make sense of what's going on and find a way to escape. It's so gripping. I loved this section of the story. I also really like the way that Stoker kind of flips the idea of being trapped on us as the readers throughout the novel, where in the very beginning in the castle, we are trapped in a literal sense with Jonathan Harker. And later on, as the story progresses, we're trapped more in the theater of our own mind than in a physical sense. And I thought it was really interesting how he slowly turns that on its head. Now, the cliffhanger that happens at the end of the castle section, which I won't get into details about for spoiler reasons, is just chef's kiss classic writing at its finest. It is so well done. It is a masterclass in tension. It is a masterclass in leaving your reader hanging for all the right reasons. Again, Stoker is bringing us back into that fear of the unknown. What happened to Jonathan? Where's Dracula? What is he going to do next? Now, of course, this is where we are introduced to the rest of the cast, specifically Lucy and Mina, who are two young female friends just at the entrance of adulthood, whose conversations mostly surround their daily lives and the flirtations that are afforded to young socialites. While Lucy is the unfortunate victim that shows us the real scope of Dracula's motives and his power, it's actually Mina who provides this kind of anchor of steadiness that eventually leads to his destruction. Mina's careful attention to detail in Jonathan's diaries and her commitment to collecting every possible scrap of evidence and knowledge needed to bring down this horrible, nightmarish figure really chips away at the helplessness that we feel as the reader as these awful things are happening to Lucy and Mina and other characters in the story. While Van Helsing is probably the most famous and well-known character from this story besides Dracula himself, in my opinion, Mina's the true hero, because not only does she orchestrate what's arguably the most crucial part of Dracula's downfall, but she also manages to reserve the strength to survive all of his vicious attacks, while the other characters are constantly leaving her in harm's way. Now, I'm a big believer in the fact that historical context can be really beneficial to understanding a lot of the themes and character behaviors that classic authors include in their stories, and I don't think that this is any different. Coming from a time period where female literary characters died from causes such as reading too many books and forgetting to put a shawl on, it's hardly surprising that Dracula's chosen prey are products of the time period that they were written in. While the fragility of women was a common theme in a lot of Victorian literature, Stoker's portrayal of Mina actually suggests that not only does she have perhaps the most important part to play in Dracula's downfall, but also that she has a strength beyond a lot of her male counterparts. In some ways, the second half of the story kind of dissolves into this ironic and morbid comedy as Van Helsing and some of the other men in the cast come up to Mina's bedroom door and are having this whole discussion about whether or not they should knock or enter the room to make sure she's all right because they're afraid of frightening her. Meanwhile, on the other side of the door, Mina is literally being viciously attacked by a literal immortal vampire. Personally, I think a knock on her door is the least of her troubles. And this leads me into my biggest criticisms of Dracula, which largely have to do with the male characters. When we first meet Van Helsing in the story, he is this effusively charming and ready to help kind of character that promises a vast knowledge of science and the supernatural. I was immediately hooked by his entrance into the story, and I thought, now we've got somebody on our side that's really going to give us some good information about vampires and how to take them down. But instead, Stoker leads us on this maddeningly merry chase after Van Helsing as he does a lot of things to try to repel vampires, but also is incredibly secretive about all of the knowledge that he has on the subject. We watch him refuse repeatedly to share information that would be crucial in a moment of need, and even I would go so far as to say that Lucy ends up in a coffin because of Van Helsing's unwillingness to share information at the right moments. I liked him less and less and less as the story went on, and I found that he was probably the most caricatured human character, with the exception perhaps of Lucy. Now, what I found most interesting about the fragility themes in this novel is that while the overt physical fragility was worn by the female characters, the mental fragility was displayed constantly through the actions and behaviors of the male characters, almost putting Lucy and Mina in harm's way because they couldn't make a decision, or they weren't sharing information, or they were just being plain stupid. This did make for a rather frustrating reading experience, as I was kind of removed from Dracula's imminent threat as the reader, and I was forced to focus more on the constant infuriating incompetence of the human characters. And while some of that, I think, is a natural progression of how the story would play out in reality, I do also feel like Stoker was utilizing some of that incompetence to drive plot points forward, which for me as a character reader can be insanely frustrating. That said, one of the ways that I really appreciated Stoker's exploration of fragility was actually through Jonathan Harker's experience. I loved the way that when he came home, he was kind of a shell of himself for a while. Stoker allowed him not to be the stalwart hero that just survives this horrible ordeal and is fine and fit as a fiddle. He's actually allowed to break down. He's actually allowed to be tended by Mina and others of the cast. He's actually allowed to be fragile because of the horrible things he's seen and experienced. One last literary aspect I wanted to touch on is that the castle sections and also Dracula's coffin and those kind of parts are not the only areas where Stoker proves himself a master of horror and description. The scene with the dead ship is some of the best, most tense and horrific description I have ever read in literature, much less classics. And the account of the ship's crew being slowly picked off one by one until the captain is alone, tossed on the seas, lashed to his ship's wheel with the last talismans of hope clutched in his dead fingers. Move over, Pirates of the Caribbean, because that whole section was eerie and terrifying and perfect. So in conclusion, having now crossed Dracula off of my classics bucket list, I would again reiterate that this is a story that I do think could be tackled by someone with less experience in classic literature. I think it is way more accessible than I was anticipating and is a lot more of an engaging story than I was anticipating. And I think that Stoker does a lot of really interesting literary things in this novel that we can learn from as readers or writers. I can really appreciate the literary impact that Bram Stoker left on storytelling and how Dracula has remained haunting bookshelves for well over 100 years. And I can even partially forgive him for the after effect that was the Twilight era, because we also got Underworld out of the mix, and I'd say that's at least a mostly fair balance. I would love to hear from you down in the comments, whether you've read Dracula or not. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of the themes or aspects of the story, whether I touched on them today or didn't. I know I barely scratched the surface with what we could have talked about in this novel because there's so much there. But I would love to hear from you, so definitely leave me a comment below. If you like my content, please consider subscribing and leaving a like on the video, as I would love to have you stay on my little corner of the internet. And I hope that you are having a fantastic week. I hope you are reading some 5-star reads, and I will see you in the next video.